Okay, so I'm going to use this PowerPoint during my presentation, and I'm very happy to share this with anybody who is interested later if they would like it. My title here is about a trenchant topic, that of minorities in East Bengal, as was mentioned in the introduction, an important topic that is both a site of great hope and great tragedy. As was mentioned, I am a historian of South Asia with a focus on Bengal and a focus on the late colonial and the early post-colonial periods of history, from the 1910s to the 1950s. Some of you may know parts of this history which bring together aspects of the history of India, in which all of Bengal was contained through most of the colonial period, and the history of Pakistan from 1947 to 71, in which East Bengal was East Pakistan, and then Bangladesh from 1971. Again, many may know some of this history, but I will go through the history through the perspective of how minorities played a role in the history of East Bengal. And I include my website there if anybody would like to look up my publications or look up any of the other materials I have online. You are most welcome to do so, and I am happy to share this later if need be. So I will speak about three moments as an angle into the history of minorities in East Bengal, from the early 1900s through the present. In the 1900s, in late colonial India, minorities started to become a formal term used in politics. It showcases a period when minority politics, as it was called, crystallized into formal political programs from the 1900s to 1940s. Though, of course, different groups we know of in Eastern Bengal, whether via religion, Hindus, Buddhists, indigenous groups, Christians, of course, they existed before then. But the idea of a political minority starts to emerge at that time. And of course, the history of this entire period is vast. It's much more than just these three moments, but these are the important highlights that allow for a larger discussion of minorities, and I'm happy to expand on any of them if there is interest. The second is the history of Pakistan, East and West, and then the creation of Bangladesh in 1971. In all cases, minorities were at the centerpiece of how politics proceeded in colonial India, why Pakistan was created, and why Bangladesh was created. So, to look at minorities in the context of early 20th century Bengal, we must start with the partition of Bengal, in 1905, which was authorized by this person pictured here, Lord Curzon, Viceroy of colonial India, from 1899 to 1905. He was propelled by colonial notions of geography and governance, as well as the census, which had just been undertaken in the 1880s, which revealed a slight majority of people living in East Bengal at the time, and a slight majority of Hindus in the West. And so the partition was done for a variety of reasons. It was seen to correspond with the majority populations, but then created minorities in these two parts of Bengal. And also, it was done to develop Eastern Bengal, to create jobs, infrastructure, educational institutions. On the right is a map of Bengal in the pre-partition time, from the 1880s. It included a vast space, a part of which is now Bangladesh, part of which is now India. In what was Bengal at that time from the colonial state, Bihar was included, Assam was included. So it was a vast space. It was seen as too unwieldy to govern as one province. So one reason was that the hinterland regions of what is now Bangladesh in the eastern part of Bengal were seen as unable to be governed. In addition to the Hindu and Muslim demography, the colonial state under Curzon sought to revive former Muslim glory to the small but visible older princely families of Muslim Bengal, including Khaja Sholimullah. By curtailing what had been seen as Hindu economic interests in Calcutta, who had become quite wealthy in the colonial period, some of them did. They had land in the east, but they also had business in the west. This change would allow for the development of what was East Bengal, what later became Bangladesh. In this context, from 1905, this is the beginning of the first kind of nationalism that focused on the issue of dividing Bengal and thinking about majorities and minorities. And there were many kinds of figures who emerged during this time with the creation of the Swadeshi movement. I will not talk about all of them, but I can discuss them in the Q&A if there is interest. But one group was a revolutionary group led by people who took to the cult of the bomb and actively planned violent acts. One such person is pictured here, Aurobindo Ghosh, whose life and political path is instructive for this moment. He was educated in England, as one sector of the Bengali Hindu elite was, reared by his father to become fluent in English, which he was. He studied Greek, Latin, and was quite good in those subjects. He was not as good in Bangla. And he placed in a high post in the competitive ICS examination. Though he stood 11th in a competition, he did not get the post and became very disillusioned and joined this facet of the movement. He joined a group called Onushilon, which, of course, as we know, means culture. It doubled as a militant nationalist group, but it was also a fitness club. It sought to counter the idea of Indian men as effeminate and weak. He was a major figure in the movement, wrote a great deal, jailed in 1908 and 9. From 1910, he left the movement totally and lived as a mystic. He was very much opposed to the idea of a divided Bengal. The movement was a movement of economic boycott based primarily in Calcutta. But it was simply impossible given how India was linked to the world economy for Indian producers to compete with cheaply produced goods in England and Europe that were coming in into India for many decades by this time. Elites in India were addicted to and integrated into that economy. So it did not work. Some Muslim elites, like the figure pictured here, Sholimullah, was a member of the princely family in East Bengal, welcomed the partition. He supported it, thought it would bring jobs to the East, bring infrastructure, education, and attention to figures like him. The colonial state was constantly attacked by various revolutionaries and then reversed the partition, making itself look inconsistent. Some of the supporters of partition, like some of the Muslim elites, felt their loyalties were not rewarded. The old territorial arrangements came back, but plans to develop the East in what is now Bangladesh, they started to develop in the 1910s and 20s. One of the plans during the first partition time, which is very important, was the mission of establishing a university in Dhaka. And that was the plan. During the first partition, it was stalled after the partition was reversed. It was stalled because of World War I, but then it came into being in 1921. So several political movements focused on minorities, not only, as we will see, those who embraced the idea of a religious minority, but many other groups who focus on caste issues, language, and other issues. But one strand of the minorities in India at the time focused on Islam. And one part of this context is the world of the 1930s and the 1940s. And the idea of Pakistan was created in the 1940s. Though the idea did not exist in the 1930s, there were people who had ideas of a future federation. Muhammad Iqbal, the philosopher in 1930, announced the plan of a future India to include separate Muslim states in the plural. But there was no mention of Pakistan. The idea was articulated by a student in Cambridge, um, Chaudhry Rahmat Ali, who came up with the anagram P for Punjab, A for Afghans, K for Kashmir. And as you can see through what I have described, they did not include Bengal. So the idea was brewing, but it did not include Bengal at the time. The person most associated with the concept of Pakistan is pictured here, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, a contemporary of Gandhi. He comes from the same state of Gujarat in Western India, trained as a lawyer in English, and he was a part of the Indian National Congress for most of his life, but then switched in the late 1920s and declared that the Congress Party was only a party focused on Hindus and focused then on minorities, the minority communities of Muslims throughout India. He saw as a solution to the problems facing Muslim minorities the declaration of Muslims as a nation, separate from Indian Hindus, in the what is now known as the infamous two-nation theory. In 1940, in Lahore, in what is now Pakistan, the Muslim League passed a resolution, the Lahore Resolution, to push for a map of India to be created anew after the independence of India and to create Muslim states in the plural in a future federation of India. But the term Pakistan is not mentioned in 1940 in the Lahore Resolution. There were many who thought about this idea, many who critiqued it. Maulana Azad, a lifelong associate of Gandhi, very much against Jinnah and the Muslim League, felt he was simply a comprador of the British Empire, and there were many others who were not accepting the idea. One person, B.R. Ambedkar, a great anti-caste leader who led struggles for Dalit groups in India, undertook a serious study of the idea, published a book about it in 1940, and he found that the proposal was based on sentiment, a sentiment of feeling that occurs when you are a minority and not recognized by the majority. But Ambedkar questioned whether Pakistan is the answer to that problem. It appeared impractical, and it was not clear if it was a passing mood or a permanent aspiration. So Jinnah became the one who took this idea in the 1940s to greater heights through World War II. Now, soon after the partitions of Bengal's 1905 reversal back to one Bengal, which had alienated a sector of Muslim Bengalis like Sholimullah, Muslims were again seen as a minority, a new idea, but further complicated by the fact that Muslims in Bengal's own population, they were just a slight majority. They had been, however, systematically marginalized from the educational and public institutions in colonial India and in Bengal. And as a response to this, many things occur, like writers who began institutions such as the Bongyo Muslim Sahitya Samiti, which was a response to the Bongyo Sahitya Porishad, which was created in 1893. The earlier Porishad, which was an institution meant to gather Bengali literature and catalog examples of Bangla throughout the ages, it did not accept the Bongyo Sahitya Porishad did not accept the inclusion of influences from Islam and the wide world of Islamic narratives, folk tales. For this reason, the Bongyo Musliman Sahitya Samiti was begun. A major figure in that movement was the great poet Nojul Islam, who was born in what is now West Bengal, Burdwan district. He was definitely exposed to various aspects of culture from Hindu and Muslim sources. He attended a maktab for his early education, learned the essentials of Islam and Arabic and Persian, but he also toured with a traveling performance troupe and learned a great deal about Hindu mythology and wrote a lot of poems about Hindu topics. He attended school in Moimunshing and then again in Burdwan, and then was recruited to fight in the Great War. He was stationed in Karachi, which was crucial for his development as a political thinker. He was 18 years old when he was stationed in Karachi, And he met Muslims of various parts of India and elsewhere. And he developed an interest in the political and aesthetic principles of Islam and derived inspiration from those principles. He also worked with others to start new journals, like a journal called Noboju, or the New Age, in 1922. He wrote a great deal about many topics. I can speak about them in the question and answer if there's any concern about them, both about the Islamic world, but also about various Hindu topics. After the war, he became interested in internationalism. He wrote a great deal about rebelling against social norms. And in many journals, including Muslim Bharat, he wrote about these issues in Bangla for a Bengali Muslim audience. One of the poems, Dhumketu, which was published in 1922, is an aggressive call to arms and quasi-religious imagery against the chains of modern identity, using a whole variety of references. One part of it that I'll read out, Ami যুগে যুগে আসি আসিয়াছি পুনমুহা বিপ্লব হেতু এই স্রষ্টার শনি মহাকাল ধূমকেতু. This is the beginning of this poem, and it then recounts different forms of social norms that he aimed to challenge. Another issue was the idea of Pakistan in Bangla, which was a source of inspiration for many at the time in the 1940s, but as a way to critique what was happening elsewhere in India. One issue that occurs is that different societies were created to discuss this issue from 1942 onwards, and their public speeches were published in various periodicals from 42 to 45 during World War II. The two figures I list here, Abu Mansur Ahmad and Abul Kalam Shamsuddin, were major leaders in this group. And they engaged with the idea of Pakistan. They revised the concept to include a fully fledged Bengali branch of Pakistan that had its own unique, internally understood elements of culture. These were to be protected and developed in the new state of Pakistan. So there was a sense of engaging with the idea of minorities in various ways. The society I mentioned, which was called a Renaissance Society, it attracted communists, radical Hindus. People like M.N. Roy attended the meetings. M.N. Roy gave a speech called Pakistan and Democracy, and he was supportive of the Bengali group. In Dhaka, there were also groups that had begun, both in Calcutta and in Dhaka. One moment in 1943 was a speech that was then published by Abu Mutar Ahmad about Purva Pakistan Bhasha, and he emphasizes the highly particular place of Bengali Muslims, their society, their economic life, their arts, their specific intellects and talents that are to be distinguished from the Hindu at that time, seen as the Hindu dominant force. This was something that is worked out in that writing and in that speech, and there are others like that from the time. Now, when we move to the second major moment that is significant for the history of minorities, that is the moment of India as a new state and Pakistan as a new state being created through a brutal and quite tragic partition of both Bengal and the Punjab. In the frenzy of partition and violence, these new entities were constructed. West Bengal became a state in India, and then there was a new country of East Pakistan, which was one wing of the new country of Pakistan. And in the initial days and years of this 1947, 48, some Bengali Muslims felt safe in the new Pakistan. They embraced this. Many Hindus fled to the western part in India. However, this was also accompanied by all sorts of forms of violence, both in terms of individuals often settling old scores, sometimes grabbing land of people who left, and sometimes the state entered to attack various groups. Nonetheless, the first declaration of Pakistan occurred in 11th August of 1947, in which Jinnah states, "You are free to go to your mosques, your temples. You are free to go to your mosques, and to any other place of worship in the state of Pakistan. You may belong to any religion, to any caste and any creed. That has nothing to do with the business of the state. However, immediately after the creation of Pakistan, though the focus on minorities was the basic impetus to create it, this new state became identified with the Muslim majority, which was seen as a religion of the majority, and various groups, Hindus, Buddhists, indigenous group, they were seen as minorities. The new Pakistan did not recognize initially Bangla as one of its national languages. It does later in the 1950s, but despite most Pakistanis being Bangla speakers, against this longer history I've outlined, the vast majority of people wrote in and embraced the language. Now, when it came to minorities at the time, many Hindus were targets of land grabs, bolstered by a new legal regime in Pakistan, which had an equivalent in India. Both of them created an Office of Enemy Property. In Pakistan, there was a law passed called Emergency Requisition of Property Act of 1948, and in East Bengal, there was also another local act, the Administration of Property of 1951, meant again for so-called enemies. This was continued in the state of Bangladesh. It allowed for the state to claim land of any individual suspected of being an enemy citizen in India, seen as Indian, and India also did the same thing. In the era of East Pakistan, at one level, the state provided a new infrastructure and promised economic development. And there are continuities from what the new state of Pakistan said and what was said during the first partition of 1905. There was a perception that an older feudal order led by Hindus was to be transcended and let go of, and that this would be a time of eternal Eid, of economic development and flourishing. On the other hand, for minorities, both India and Pakistan defined enemies through war. And after the 1964 riots in Dhaka, which targeted mostly Hindus but other groups, also other regions in Khulna and other places, Pakistan geared up for and fought a war with India over contested territory in Kashmir, in which the East Pakistan state continued this control over land owned by minorities through the 1965 Enemy Property Custody and Registration Order. And that is a continuation of the earlier law. Enemy property was deemed property of the state. Many people simply fled during the time. 1966 East Pakistan Enemy Property Lands and Buildings Administration Order is in 1966. But the war was over quickly by the end of 1965. Yet after the war, the usage of the term enemy referred to Hindus, though the vast majority of people were born and bred in their homes in East Bengal and never had any relation to India, were Bangladeshi. They created, however, heightened suspicion after 1965. Now, though there are minorities of so many groups, Hindus, Buddhists, Christians, indigenous groups, Chakma and others, Hindus had been singled out at that time as alleged proxy citizens of India since the creation of Pakistan, and there was a very similar activity in India which identified Muslims as having a loyalty to Pakistan. When we get to Bangladesh, though all of this was happening from 1947, from 1952, the language movement began, led by students and young people. The focus on language and the broader shared culture of East Bengal prevailed in that moment. As was mentioned in the introduction, it was a populist movement meant to destabilize the contradictions inherent in the Pakistani state, in which the western part diverted almost all of the resources to the west. Most of the jobs were in the west. The peoples of the east served in subservient roles to the west and was seen as an economic colony of the west for most of the years of 24 years in Pakistan, to establish a Bangladesh, initially formally a secular and socialist state for all of the people of East Bengal. But the minority issues stayed, but they changed form. Once Bangladesh came about, It was a state that initially was focused on Bangla speakers, which was a way to unify people, but also the specific landmass of East Bengal, in which there are many groups of different origins, to focus on the riverine and deltaic environment of Bangladesh. This was the focus during the time. Minorities, though, in Bangladesh from 1971 experienced many different experiences, sometimes indifference by the state, sometimes formal dispossession by various means. The laws that were created in 1948 have stayed and continue in both Bangladesh and in India. The phrase Joy Bangla was used in the early days of the language movement to establish an independent Bangladesh. But the laws that would enable the appropriation of property, they continued. Hindu communities now face what is now called a Vested Property Act, have seen different types of dispossession, again comparable to what Muslims have faced in India. In the 1980s, there's a change in the Bangladeshi outlook to itself in its constitution. Islam is mentioned in the 1988 amendments to the constitution. It changes the outlook of Bangladesh, though, of course, then and before and through the present and now, minorities, of course, exist. But Hindus have still been often targeted as so-called proxy citizens. To recapitulate, there are, of course, many different kinds of minorities in Bangladesh: religious, linguistic, and regional. But Hindus have often been seen as exceptional groups because of their suspected loyalty in relations to India, and in many cases, the ownership of valuable pieces of land. Nonetheless, in recent history, many have experienced attacks on places of worship, kidnappings, intimidations, and expropriation of land. Though this is not written into the state of Bangladesh, this is a part of the long, entangled history of minority politics and its lack of resolution. I will end by citing a figure who um, passed away a few years ago, former teacher and a person who had invested in humanist research and research about the history of Bangladesh as well as the literature and culture of Bangladesh. Anisujaman, who is pictured here, literary critic, movement. He was active in the language movement, like most of the figures of the generation, and educationist. He researched at the University of Chicago in the 1960s. He was one of the people in the 1960s in the United States who was offering information about what was happening in then East Pakistan, what is now Bangladesh. And he devoted a good chunk of his life to studying Muslim Bengali writers to give voice to those who had been marginalized in the past and to those who later would be Bangladeshi. He taught for most of his career in Dhaka University, again, an institution that was made possible because of the first partition and then comes into being later in the 1920s. He also had consulted on the making of the Bangladesh Constitution, which comes out in 1972. And the original copy, actually, of the Constitution does exist in the University of Chicago Library. He mentioned soon before he passed in 2020 that Bangladesh was formed out of the will of the East Bengali people of all religions and all backgrounds to create a free Bangladesh and to uphold the initial support that had always been there to support minorities of all kinds. And with that, I will end my presentation. Thank you very much for your time and for your attention.
Thank you to our respected speaker, Dr. Neilesh Bose. That was a really informative session. Right now, we will go to our Q&A session. If anyone has any question regarding today's session to our respected speaker, please raise your hand. Or you can write down your question in chat if you have any problem in your audio section.
And also, if questions come later, you can always email them to me if there is any interest.
Okay, Harun, Miss Harun, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Bose. I'm Obunti Harun. I am a faculty at the University of Liberal Arts, Bangladesh, and quite fan of your works because I was also writing a paper on Muslim literature in the 19th century. And nevertheless, I took a lot from you and your works. Um,
You
this is not particularly related. Yeah, I had many questions, but first question is this is not particularly related with this presentation. But one thing is that whenever we talk about the Muslim intellectuals in the late 19th century or the early 20th century, we often that also you wrote in your book recasting region, but often we relate them with the indicators related to Bengali Renaissance. So whenever be it the Al Islam group or even the Shikha group, whoever there are, we often refer to them. Other people who, I mean, what I want to mean that the other writers or the intellectuals, maybe they are vernacular intellectuals, but somehow they became marginalized through this process. And for example, the people who came from Bortala Sahitya or Puthi Sahitya, or also the group of elites who were more engaged or invested in Urdu literature or Persian literature from Bengal. I'm sure that you must know that there are two major centers. Kolkata was one of the big centers for Persian literature and also Dhaka. So since these people were marginalized, these intellectuals, don't you think that unresolved question throughout the partition and Pakistan has led to these atrocities in Bengal, which we are facing now, in Bangladesh, which we are facing now, because these people were somehow marginalized with this process of secularization of literature? That is my one question. And as you also mentioned that whenever we talk about minoritization process, of course, that was in your book that the census of the 19th century that started all this chaos, that majority minority issues. But often we fall in the binary that my majority minority Hindu Muslim. But what about the other people, like who you mentioned a bit, but like these people who are non-Bengalis, like the Chakmas, Garos, and others. And their life was also segregated, partitioned, like the Garos got partitioned, like the Mizos got partitioned. But since we fail to address them, maybe that's a failure of the nationalist state, but also that is the dominance of Bengalism. I'm not saying Bengali nationalism, but both Hindus and Muslims were trapped into that. So I would like to have your reflections on this. Thank you very much for this intriguing session.
Thank you very much for that wonderful commentary and set of questions. And it fills my heart to know that you have read my work and that it has been beneficial to you. Also, I would say two things. I fully agree with the first point, and I didn't mention this in detail in this session, but it is an important issue in the history of colonial Bengal, and that is that from the late 19th century, there developed a link between language and literature and the ethno-territorial sensibility of a group that Bengali people, so-called, would be identified with the Bangla language. And this developed, this actually speaks to the question of Irfan Ahmad's idea of Hindu Orientalism, and I'll get to that in a minute. But that idea of linking a language and a literature to an ethnic group and then being the basis of a politics, that is the original limit. So there, in the creation of a Bengali literary culture that was dominated initially by the Bhodralok in Calcutta, this connection had already been established and was enabled by many of the emergent fields of study, of comparative literature, linguistics, religion. They're all trying to make these points, and those who are thinking about literature are doing so. When later, 100 years later, Muslims in the Bengali context start to enter into this discussion, they too are stuck with this link of a language, Bangla, with a notion of a group and an ethno-territorial sense of a group, which then fully erases the fact that of all types, but let's say with Islam, in Calcutta, there is a vast history of literary culture, a religious culture, and a set of political practices that cannot be slotted into this ethno-linguistic container. But that is avoided once we find this literary nationalism developing. So it's difficult from the rise of the idea of Apurbo Pakistan as a challenge to Pakistan. It's difficult to include this range of resources, Urdu, Farsi, other languages too. Similarly, all of the other groups in Bangladesh who have long histories, who have other linguistic and ethno-linguistic cultural histories, they are not included in the idea either of Pakistan or of Bangladesh, at least at its inception. I think what now Bangladesh can confront is a way to remake the vision of Bangladesh, given the recent events in Bangladesh, to reimagine what Bangladesh can be and not be either chained to a version of a secular linguistic link to a language and a territory, and also not be linked to the idea of a majority group as defining how the people in a particular nation state will live. So those things I think are the issues that I would fully agree are the issues facing Bangladesh and need to be confronted. And in the future, I think more scholars will be doing work on this precise issue.
Okay, that was a really good question. Muhammad Hussein, he write a question in chat. What is your assessment of Irfan Ahmed's idea of Hindu Orientalism? Is it applicable in a historical sense to Bengal, or is it a problematic framework / lens through which to see the region?
Yes, thank you, Mohammed Hussein, for the question. So, as I mentioned, this is relevant to my first answer. Now, I think the extent to which Irfan Ahmad takes the argument of Hindu Orientalism is quite far. And so I agree with the overall approach that there was a version of Orientalism that was being developed by Indian intellectuals, many of whom were Hindu, who then start to develop ideas about Islam through a complex knowledge production from the early 19th century. I agree with that. But I also think that there are many figures who need not be slotted into that kind of container. And even the same people, people like Ram Mohan Roy, who is a major figure of early 19th century Bengal, and his relationship to Islam is complicated. It is something that I address in my new book I published this year, in which I argue that he is informed by all of the various biases that are attending to European writers. He cannot be free of those. But later in history, many who start to study Islam in the Bangla language and from various vantage points are not chained to a so-called Hindu Orientalist approach to either religion or to Islam in specific terms. So I would say I appreciate his work and I agree with the original sentiment, but that he may take it too far for Bengal. Um, okay.
Okay, Muhammad Hussain asked another question. Would it be better to study the history of Bengal within South Asian area studies, or can it be more fruitful to study it within Southeast Asian studies? Although Iftikhar Iqbal's new framework in his upcoming book. I forgot. He forgot that book's name. Sorry.
Actually, it is interesting that you say that. I have this book right here. It is called The Range of the River, and a riverine history of empire across China, India, and Southeast Asia. So, speaking also back to the issue of so-called Hindu Orientalism, would this study of history of Bengal within South Asian studies, area studies, be more fruitful, or this framework? I would say the latter, not only because I am a old and very dear friend of Iftikhar Iqbal, but I believe that his framework is useful because he can show through his work that the history of rivers is not only a history that is connected to other parts of India or Bangladesh. It only makes sense if you see it as it is connected to other parts of Asia, as well as place it in a comparative framework with other parts of Asia. And I would say that there is a parallel approach one can take to the study of language and literature and culture, that it should not be encased in, to use Irfan Ahmed's terms, Hindu Orientalism, because then it ends the question that we can ask. We won't pursue any more research. We should always try to open ourselves to what the past can teach us, and not be chained to any one version of it. The
Oh, sorry. That was a technical problem. My audio was mute. Okay. Mr. Mustahid asked another question. You say after 80s Hindus are again seen as agents of India, then how do you see this issue that these so-called Indian agents were mostly attacked by another known Indian agent and so-called secular government of Awami League? I mean, that's really interesting question, not gonna lie.
Yeah, I mean, yes. So at one level, how can I put this? It is not the case that India was not involved in various machinations to undermine Pakistan from the beginning of Pakistan's existence. And it is not to be denied that the later government of the Awami League also had worked with India to undermine facets of what became Bangladesh. This is undeniable. However, I would say that the history, if we place it not from the perspective of war or diplomacy, to understand Bangladesh not through war or diplomacy, but through the people who live in East Bengal, who are of all sorts of religions and languages. To understand their lives, I would say that the vast majority of people who were affected by all of the enemy property laws were not actual agents of India. However, I will say that the relationship of India and Pakistan has always been one in which India had access to undermining parts of Pakistan and Bangladesh.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Niels Bose. Any more question from anyone? If you want to ask question, you can do it right now or write down your question in chat. Looks like no more question. Okay, thank you, Dr. Neilesh Bose, for joining us today. That was a really informative session. But now we will end our session. But before we conclude our today's session, we humbly request everyone present to keep our dear brother Usman Hadi in your prayers. He was recently the victim of grave and violent attack orchestrated by Bangladesh Awami League's terrorists. We pray for his safety, strength, and a swift and full recovery. With this hope and solidarity, we bring today's session to an end. Thank you all for your presence and thoughtful engagement. Thank you.